I was sitting at the far end of the mahogany conference table, watching the condensation drip down my water glass, when my younger brother decided to turn my entire life into a punchline. He didn't use a hammer. Marcus prefers the scalpel. He leaned back, refilling someone's wine with that practiced, effortless grace of a man who has never been the punchline himself, and let out a soft, pitying chuckle. He didn't call me a failure to my face. That's too messy for our family. Instead, he called me a cautionary tale. He said it with a sideways glint in his eye, the kind of smile that suggests he's doing you a favor by pointing out your flaws. Nadia's been married to her spreadsheets for so long, he told the table, that the IRS is probably going to file them as common-law spouses any day now. The room erupted. It was that comfortable, rhythmic laughter of people who have heard the same joke for a decade and finally feel safe enough to lean into it. I laughed too. I've learned that in this family, laughter is the only armor that doesn't make you look defensive. I've spent the better part of 10 years nodding along to the narrative that I am the cold, clinical elder sister who traded a heartbeat for a career. But that night, something inside the architecture of my life shifted. It wasn't a loud break. It was the sound of ice groaning under the weight of a frozen lake, a quiet structural surrender. I set my glass down, the click of the crystal against the wood cutting through the tail end of Marcus's amusement. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just looked him in the eye and said, I've actually been married to a human being for almost 9 years. His name is Owen. He's an architect. And he's the reason I don't mind your jokes. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bruise. My mother's hand froze mid-air, clutching a linen napkin like a white flag. Marcus, the man who had spent the last 20 minutes acting like the self-appointed king of the room, looked like he'd been slapped with a reality he didn't have the tools to process. Do you ever wonder how much of your identity is actually yours, and how much of it is just a costume your family forced you to wear because it made their own lives feel more stable? To understand why I kept a husband a secret for nearly a decade, you have to understand the soil I grew up in. My parents, Bertram and Pauline, are the kind of people who measure success with a slide rule. My father spent nearly 30 years as a civil engineer, building bridges and roads across Ohio that were designed to endure. My mother ran the administrative side of a pediatric practice with a terrifying efficiency. They are practical people. They believe in what they can see, what they can document, and what they can brag about at a neighborhood barbecue. When Marcus married his college sweetheart at 26 and bought a house with a wraparound porch 40 minutes from my parents' front door, he provided them with a unit of measurement. When he produced a daughter 2 years later, he became the gold standard. In my family, life isn't a journey, it's a checklist. If you aren't checking the boxes they recognize, they assume the pen is broken. Marcus and I were never enemies, but we were like two parallel hallways in an old building. We shared the same foundation, but we never shared a wall. At our family dinners, we functioned through a series of polite interrogations. The subtext was always there, vibrating under the table like a humming wire. What is Nadia doing with her life? Why isn't she more like us? What I was doing was medical informatics. I was building digital nervous systems for hospital networks, making sure that when a patient is wheeled into an ER in a different state, the doctors don't kill them because they can't see their allergy list. It's technical, it's high stakes, and it's utterly invisible to people who think a good job involves a company car and a title they can explain to their dentist. For 13 years, I've been closing the gaps that people don't even know exist. I've built a team of 41 experts who look to me for leadership. But in that dining room in Columbus, I wasn't a leader. I was just the girl who forgot to get a life. Is it any wonder I decided to build a world they couldn't touch? I met Owen at a panel in Seattle 9.5 years ago. He was talking about sustainable hospital design, arguing that the physical space of a clinic affects the recovery rate of a patient as much as the medicine does. I challenged him. I told him his designs were beautiful but ignored the data infrastructure required to make them functional. We argued for 3 hours over a dinner that neither of us tasted. We argued until the waiters started stacking chairs on the tables around us. When he flew back to Portland and I flew back to Denver, the argument didn't stop. It just moved to text messages and late-night phone calls that stretched until the sun came up. We were married 11 months later. It was a Thursday in Albuquerque, a city chosen simply because neither of us had ever been there. The air smelled of sage and dust, and the heat was the kind of dry intensity that makes everything feel permanent. There were 8 people in that courthouse. His sister, a few close friends, and an officiant named George who wore a bolo tie and told us he still got misty-eyed after 19 years of paperwork. It was perfect. It was ours. I didn't invite my parents. I didn't tell Marcus. At the time, I told myself I was protecting Owen. I told myself that if I brought him into the arena of my family, they would do to him what they did to everything else I loved. They would measure him, find him wanting, and then turn him into a footnote. But if I'm being honest, I was also protecting myself. I had spent so long being the career woman in their story that I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing I had found the very thing they insisted I was missing. The years that followed were a strange, beautiful dance of duality. In Denver, I was a wife. Owen and I built a life that was layered with private jokes, shared goals, and the kind of intimacy that only grows when no one is watching. He knew the names of my developers. I knew the stress load of his structural beams. We were a team, but the moment I crossed the threshold of my parents' house, I stepped back into the skin of the lonely sister. It wasn't a dark secret, not really. Owen wasn't hidden. He just wasn't shared. He attended my professional galas. He knew my real friends. He was the first person I called when my team landed a massive contract. But whenever Marcus called to tell me about a great guy at his firm who was recently divorced and perfect for a woman of my age, I just stayed silent. I let him believe his own version of reality. Why fight a ghost when the ghost isn't bothering you? But silence has a predatory way of growing. It starts as a shield, and it ends as a wall. Have you ever realized that by protecting your peace, you've actually just built your own prison? The first real crack in the wall happened 2 winters ago. My father had a cardiac event, a warning shot. The doctors called it. I drove through a blizzard to get to Columbus, my heart hammering against my ribs the whole way. I sat in that sterile, white-tiled waiting room for 6 hours, holding my mother's shaking hand. She kept looking at me with this profound, agonizing pity. "Nadia," she whispered, "you really shouldn't have to do this by yourself. I hate that you're alone in this." I had my phone in my pocket. It was vibrating every 10 minutes with texts from Owen. How's his heart rate? What's the ejection fraction? Do you need me to fly out? I'm here. I'm right here. He was more there than anyone else in that hospital, but I couldn't tell her. I couldn't explain that I had a husband who was currently researching the best cardiac surgeons in the Midwest while my brother was busy complaining about the hospital's cafeteria coffee. I sat there in the silence of my own making, feeling the weight of 9 years of omissions pressing down on my chest. I realized then that I wasn't just keeping a secret. I was denying my family the chance to actually know me. But old habits are hard to kill, and the fear of being minimized was still stronger than the urge to be seen. The birthday dinner for my mother was supposed to be a low-key affair. 12 people, a catered spread of heavy appetizers, and Marcus, who always arrives 45 minutes early to claim the emotional high ground. By the time I walked in, the air was already thick with the smell of expensive bourbon and the suffocating familiarity of family dynamics. Marcus's wife Dana gave me that look, the one she's perfected over the years. It's a look of neutral solidarity, the kind of gaze you give a fellow prisoner who has stopped trying to escape. Marcus started in on me before I'd even taken off my coat. "Nadia, you look exhausted. Are those dark circles a new fashion choice, or are you just working 20-hour days again?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the table, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who thinks his life is a blueprint for everyone else's. "I don't know why you make it so hard on yourself, sis. You're not getting any younger. You're going to be 41 soon, rattling around in that big apartment by yourself. Don't you think it's time to admit that the job isn't going to hold your hand when you're 80? He reached over and squeezed Dana's hand, a silent, smug gesture of, "Look what I have that you don't." That was the moment. That was the tiny structural shift. I felt a wave of shame, not for myself, but for him. For the smallness of a man who needed to belittle his sister's life just to feel the warmth of his own. "I'm not on my own, Marcus," I said. My voice was calm, but there was a razor edge underneath it. "I've been married for almost 9 years. The room didn't just go quiet, it went vacuum sealed. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a car crash where the world is trying to decide if it's still turning. My mother walked in from the kitchen with a platter of roasted vegetables. She sensed the change in the atmosphere immediately. She set the tray down and looked at me, her eyes searching my face for the punchline she expected to follow. I didn't give her one. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I didn't say a word as I slid it across the polished wood of the table. There was a photo of Owen and me on the roof of his firm's project in Portland, the city glowing behind us like a sea of amber. There was another from last spring, him with his arm around me at my department's recognition event, both of us mid-laugh at some joke a colleague had made. And then I scrolled to the one from the Albuquerque courthouse. Owen in his gray suit looking at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. Me, holding a small, unexpected bunch of desert flowers that George had found in a desk drawer. Marcus picked up the phone. I watched his face. I watched the disbelief flicker in his eyes, followed by that frantic, rapid-fire recalculation that happens when a person realizes the story they've been telling for a decade is a lie. He looked like a man who had been building a puzzle only to find out he was using the wrong box. Why? He finally managed to choke out. He didn't look at me. He looked at the photo of Owen. Why wouldn't you tell us? 9 years, Nadia. You let us believe. You let us worry. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to apologize for my existence. Do you even know what I did at work last quarter? I asked. Marcus blinked. You do the data stuff, for the hospitals. I integrated the regional networks for the entire tri-state area, I said. I presented mortality data to the state board that changed the policy for 11 counties. It's going to save lives, Marcus. Real, breathing people. I sent a summary of that to the family group chat in February. Do you remember what you said? He opened his mouth, then closed it. You sent a thumbs-up emoji, I reminded him. And then you immediately posted a 3-minute video of your daughter's school play. My life's work was a 3-second distraction before we went back to talking about you. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. I stopped sharing the things that mattered to me because they disappeared in this room. They became background noise, and when I found someone I loved, someone I was truly proud of, I made a choice. I kept him private for the same reason I stopped explaining my job. I didn't need this room to understand me anymore. I had someone who already did. My father, who had been sitting at the head of the table like a stone monument, finally spoke my name. Nadia. It was low, careful, and stripped of the usual authority. Are you angry? No, I told him, and I meant it. I'm just finished. Marcus tried one last time. He stood up, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and a defensive kind of hurt. It's not fair, he stammered. This is an ambush. You can't expect people to know things you don't tell them. We're your family. I stood up too, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. You're right, I said. I didn't tell you, but you never asked a question that wasn't already wrapped in an insult. Those two things can both be true. I walked through my parents' kitchen, a room I had spent a lifetime trying to fit into. I passed the refrigerator, which was a shrine to Marcus's life, photos of his house, his kids, his vacations. There wasn't a single scrap of my world on that door. I walked out into the November cold, and the air felt like a benediction. Loneliness makes dangerous choices feel reasonable, but I wasn't lonely anymore. I was finally, for the first time in 9 years, completely whole. The aftermath was slow. My mother called me 4 days later. There was no lecture, no drama. Just a quiet, shaky voice asking if she could meet him. She didn't ask why, again. I think she finally understood the answer. When I told Owen, he just smiled and said, "It's about time. I've been very patient." He had been. That was the uncomplicated truth of our marriage. He had been a ghost to my family, but he was the most solid thing in my world. They came to Denver in the spring. My father, surprisingly, had spent the months leading up to the visit researching Owen's firm. Within 30 minutes of meeting him, he was asking Owen about the structural integrity of passive solar glass. Seeing my father treat my husband with the professional respect he had never quite given me, it did something to me. I had to go into the kitchen to open a second bottle of wine just so they wouldn't see my eyes watering. My mother followed me in. She stood by the counter, watching me for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'm sorry we made it feel like you had to protect him from us." That was the only apology I ever needed. Marcus and I have talked a few times since then. The conversations are harder now because the cautionary tale script is gone. He's forced to actually look at me, and I'm forced to let him. In our last call, he admitted something he'd never said before. "I didn't realize I was making you smaller," he told me. "I thought I was just being a brother. I thought I was worrying about you." "I know," I told him, "but worry without curiosity is just a form of control." On the night of that dinner, as I drove through the quiet, dark streets of Columbus, I felt a strange sense of release. The city was doing its maintenance, the traffic lights cycling for no one, the world humming in the dark. I parked outside my building, sat in the stillness for a moment, and then I called Owen. I told him everything. Every word Marcus said, every look on my mother's face, every second of the silence. He listened the way he always does, with a quality of attention that makes you feel like the only person on earth. When I finished, he asked, "How do you feel?" "I feel like I've been trying to have a conversation in a room with terrible reception for a decade," I said, "and someone finally just picked up the signal." He laughed, and even through the phone I could feel the warmth of it. "Come home soon," he said. I was already on my way. There are people in your life who love a version of you they've invented. They aren't always trying to be cruel, sometimes they're just afraid of what the real version of you might require of them. I spent years thinking that my silence was the price I had to pay for peace. What I didn't realize was that the silence was costing me the very thing I was trying to save. If you're reading this, I have to ask, have you ever kept something you loved invisible just to keep it safe? And did you ever stop to ask what that protection was actually costing you? Because at some point, the secret becomes a weight you can no longer carry. Desire whispers louder than guilt, and eventually, the truth is the only thing that will let you breathe. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the invisible member of your own family, please hit the like button and subscribe. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. I want to know, what's the one thing you're still hiding to keep the peace?